Welcome to another edition of Cavanaugh's Corner, the labor talk show here in southern Maine on public access television. I'm Mike Cavanaugh, and I'm host of our rather unique show where we have an opportunity to discuss issues of the day from a perspective that you might not always get on the regular network television. We try to give this a perspective from labor and our allies. This afternoon we are talking about a topic that is really on the front pages of today's newspaper. It's probably leading the stories or somewhere near the lead of the stories on the network news this evening, and that's the situation in the country of Haiti. Now, there are people watching this show who may wonder, what is it that Haiti has to do with our situation here in Maine? Why should a labor union be concerned with the conditions of the people in Haiti and the impact that may be having both on them and on us? And we hope through the course of the show to at least answer or try to answer some of those questions. And here to help me do that and to talk about the issue of Haiti, we have assembled a cast not quite of thousands, but of four people who bring with them a collective experience and expertise about Haiti that we are, it's a rare opportunity to have people like this together at one time to talk about this important issue. To my immediate right is Lou Bergeron. Lou is president of Friends International and the Center for Intercultural Education, located in Portland. Welcome.
Thank you.
To my far right is Charles Carpenter. Charles is a local photographer from Scarborough who has recently traveled to Haiti a couple of times this year and have recently returned in the last few weeks. Charles will be able to share with us some of his photos and observations about the conditions in Haiti today. So thank you for coming. To my far left is Magda Adrien. Magda is a Haitian national. She was born and grew up in Haiti until the ripe old age of 9 years old, and has moved here to Portland and has family members, and we'll be talking about your personal experiences in Haiti and your concerns today. Thank you for coming. And to my immediate left is Avi Chomsky. Avi teaches Latin American history at Bates College in Lewiston and is here as our resident historian and expert from the historical perspective, so thank you. Probably the best way, we've just been discussing this for some time before going on camera, and we decided that perhaps the best way for us to begin our show is to provide for our viewers a short video excerpt from a much longer film. There's a film called Haiti Killing the Dream, which we would recommend to viewers as well. It's an hour-long film. We're going to take a look at a short 3-minute segment from that at the very beginning of the film that will hopefully give some background perspective for you about the situation in Haiti today. So let's go to the videotape.
Peuple haïtien, nous 6 millions. Sous chaque 100 000 gains, on qui bien. Ça fait 6 000 qui gagnent l'argent. Est-ce que c'est bon Dieu qui veut le comme ça? Nous avons une réponse là, nous c'est le roi. Pas quoi dans la Bible, elle écrit ça. Depuis l'Ancien Testament, esclaves toujours gommés contre roi. Yo lité pour yo casser chaîne. Yo te gommés contre Pharaon.
The last 20 years has seen an exodus of Haitians fleeing their troubled island. Some washing up on the shores of South Florida, where they had dreamed of finding safety and freedom. In 1991, a popular priest, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, became the first democratically elected president of Haiti, inspiring hope for an end to the nation's suffering.
If we look at Haitian people, we can say it's a holy people. The way they die for democracy, fighting without violence against weapons. Today, it's not just a question of Haitian people, it's a question of democracy throughout the world.
After years of controlling the country, the U.S.-trained Haitian military was still not ready for democracy, and they staged a coup.
All day they are shooting people. There's no peace in Haiti. This is why I took the children and fled to find security with them. because the army is shooting into people's home when they know you are supporter of the movement.
Once again, thousands of Haitians fled for the refuge of America, but instead they were interdicted, imprisoned, and forcibly returned.
Has there ever been a time in our history where we've repatriated people to a nation governed by a group of people who we did not recognize?
Yeah, I'm afraid I can't answer that, Congressman.
Haiti's nightmare tests the courage of its people and the conscience of America. Washington's promise to defend democracy and a new world order rings hollow here in its own backyard.
Welcome back. We just had the opportunity to look at a short video clip giving some of the brief background of the history of the situation in Haiti. But for a more thorough explanation and putting this in some context, let us turn first to our historian, Avi Chomsky. Could you give us a little profile? What has the situation been in Haiti?
I think in giving you the profile, I'd like to emphasize that a lot of the way the discussion of Haiti is framed in the media today, and what most people probably hear, is based on a couple of myths about Haiti's history. And about U.S. policy in Haiti and what it's been. So as I talk about the history, I'd like to sort of clarify that. Generally, Haiti is presented as a country which is isolated, that for some sort of inexplicable reason it's very poor. There's often a racist underpinning to this, that it's very poor because it's very black, that those two are related, that it's culturally very alien to us, that underdevelopment in Haiti is somehow inherently a part of Haiti. And I think that myth is based on really not looking at Haitian history and at the history of U.S. involvement in Haiti and U.S. policy in Haiti. In fact, over the course of this century, the United States has been very deeply involved in Haiti politically and economically, from actually militarily occupying the country between 1915 and 1934, leaving the country having created an army and trained an army, just what they're talking about doing today, which is the roots of today's army, with very strong economic involvement in Haiti, and that a lot of the reason for Haiti's underdevelopment and poverty today is because of the history of U.S. involvement in Haiti and the kinds of policies that the U.S. has followed, economic policies and then political policies needed to keep those economic policies in place.
So a point that you're making is that this is not something that's this just didn't happen. There's a long history to Haiti that brings us to the unhappy situation that we're facing today.
And a long history of U.S. control of what's happening in Haiti. That is, when Clinton gets on the air and says, well, terrible things are happening in Haiti, what he doesn't say is, and they're our fault.
And Haiti is no better off today than they were in the two interventions militarily that we have been in the 30s and in the 50s, early 50s.
And how about, Magda, from your perspective now, you grew up in Haiti, and I don't want to date you necessarily, but you were there till age 9. Tell us a little bit about the conditions of Haiti that you know from firsthand experience and from your family's experience.
Well, growing up there, we played as children played. I played children games in the streets. When it was supper time, when the sun went down, we were called in and had supper. It was a beautiful childhood. There was no trauma. We never wanted for food or shelter. And I can't remember any of my little friends starving. It was a wonderful childhood, beautiful. Remember, it was very filling, and it makes my heart heavy. What's going on now, and the family that we have back there. When I speak to my dad, they do suffer, and it's completely different from what it was when I was a child.
And so, I mean, your own personal perspective is the situation in Haiti has deteriorated substantially in the last few number of years.
Absolutely. When I speak to my father and we get letters from the family back there, it's very sad. Sometimes people go hungry, and that never happened when I was a child in Haiti. And just the tyranny and the terror. I mean, there was always a bit of terror. You had to always guard your tongue when I was a child. But now it's just the violence and the killing, the brutality of it seems it's been magnified 10 times. There's no place to run for cover. There's no place for safety.
And when you came to the United States, you weren't part of a flotilla of people escaping on rafts as they are today, is that correct?
We came on American Airlines
Yeah.
into Kennedy Airport.
Yeah. Okay.
And you came during Papa Doc's regime, is that
Yes,
correct?
exactly.
Which was known in the United States or reported in the press to be a very repressive regime as well, isn't it?
Well, I have no, I saw nothing of it as a child, and I don't remember secret meetings in our homes either. I never saw people scouring in terror. Maybe I was sheltered,
Okay.
but.
Okay. But that is, at least as it was reported to be the situation today, and I wonder if, Charles, you might share with the viewers a little bit your experience now. As we said in the introduction, you've recently returned from Haiti, and perhaps you could talk a little bit about what you saw when you were there and when that was.
That's correct. I can't imagine a childhood in those streets today. You certainly wouldn't play in those streets if you could find the streets. All right. Maybe it'd be best right now if I could show these slides here taken over the last few weeks.
Sure. Why don't we pull
can
that up?
contrast that to what we were just talking about here.
Okay.
Today, this is the main street in Port-au-Prince. It's called Harry Truman Boulevard. You can see there's street lights there. They haven't operated for over 2.5 years because there's no fuel, there's no electricity, no fuel to run the generators. Also in Port-au-Prince, because there's no fuel due to the embargo, there's no garbage pickup. There are huge mounds of garbage. I mean, some of these garbage stacks are 2 stories high or taller, okay? There's literally no area of the city that you can walk through in a normal fashion. Most of the city is covered with garbage.
This is the capital city. Now, for viewers
Yes.
who aren't familiar with Port-au-Prince, this is...
Right. Port-au-Prince right now, today, has approximately 1.5 million people crammed into it, okay? I think in the past it was more like 750,000, something like that, about half that size. So it's grown quite a bit over the last couple of years. So it is a very large city with no water system, no electricity, well, a little bit. The generators are turned on, last 2 trips, the generators are turned on maybe 1 hour a day. That's in Port-au-Prince. The rest of Haiti, most of Haiti, has no electricity ever. This is, again, another view here of Harry Truman Boulevard. It's interesting because you see these people with a 5-gallon plastic pails. What they're doing is getting their daily water supply out of the sewage system, basically the storm sewers, open sewers. This right here is a current Port-au-Prince gas station. Since the embargo, the gas stations have been shut down. The result is that the gas is sold out of these 1-gallon milk containers on the street corners. It's interesting that in Port-au-Prince that I believe the estimate is 40,000 cars in all of Haiti, probably 30,000 are in Port-au-Prince, and it seemed like every one was still running. Okay, there was no sign that there was any diminishing of the automobiles. Literally, the roads are torn to pieces. The stoplights don't work. There's no traffic control. There should be no fuel, but the place was full of cars and buses and trucks. It's also interesting that most of Haiti does run on diesel fuel. Okay, most of the automobiles, the trucks, etc., are diesel, and diesel fuel has entered the country throughout the embargo as humanitarian fuel, allegedly for cooking. Okay, you don't need it for heating. So most of the country, in spite of what we hear about the gasoline, et cetera, coming in from the Dominican Republic, most of the fuel is coming in through endorsed shipments of humanitarian diesel fuel. And we confirmed that talking with people. We even watched it being unloaded when we were there.
And is that being confiscated by the...
A lot of it does. You could watch a good part of it being loaded onto trucks that were probably controlled by the military and stored in the warehouses down by the docks there, as you read in the papers. That part is true. But there's been a steady flow of fuel into the city, at least enough to keep the automobiles and trucks running. Presumably not enough to keep the generators and that sort of thing running.
Let me just interrupt you here for a second to describe, or ask a couple of you perhaps describe to the viewers. You're making reference here to diesel fuel getting through the embargo, and I'm not sure we've really made it clear to people what the embargo is or why the embargo is, and perhaps to have these pictures make better sense, someone would like to talk a little bit about what the embargo is that we're discussing right now.
The embargo originally was simply an embargo of arms and fuel. I think that's correct, 2.5 years ago. The 21st of last month, it was up to include almost everything, which literally shut the country down as far as what little industry remained and that sort of thing. But originally, for 2.5 years, it was an embargo of fuel and arms and spare parts for automobiles and that sort of thing.
Embargo imposed by?
This is imposed by the U.S. government.
By the U.S. government.
It is endorsed by the United Nations.
Right, okay.
Allegedly.
Okay.
When we talk about U.S. policy in Haiti and the embargo, I think that it's also a contested issue because while the U.S. from the day of the coup in words said that they supported the restoration of democracy and then that was the reason for this embargo, their actions in putting into place an embargo that was not only very incomplete but also very leaky led many Haitians and many human rights organizations in the United States to say there's not very much strength behind this embargo, not very much resolve to restore Aristide, and other kinds of U.S. policies during this period, which I guess we'll talk about later,
Yes.
have led people to that same conclusion.
Yeah, it's a very fair statement that all the embargo did was to hurt the poor people. They were borderline anyways up to that point. They were barely surviving, and the embargo cut down what little chance they had of fuel, electricity, transportation, movement of goods and services, jobs. In February, for example, there was a fair amount of the assembly type of industry in Port-au-Prince. By February, 80% was shut down, and by the 21st of last month, 100% of that was shut down. So you're talking about Port-au-Prince being a city of 1.5 million people, where I've heard estimates probably 95% or more of those people have no job, no income. You hear in Haiti that the national income is around $150, $200 a year, something like that. Remember, that means you have 5% of the people making a moderate wage and 95% making no income of any sort.
But also, I think, Jack, you mentioned, the electricity only being off on 1 or 2 hours a day and so forth. And I remember my first trip there in 1990. That was the same then, and they don't have the generating capacity to even do that if they wanted to, even if the fuel were there.
Right, that's true. That, like many third world countries, they have a problem with electric supply, but the people I talked to did own refrigerators, for example. They did have enough electricity to keep their food cold if they could afford a refrigerator to lead a somewhat normal existence. When you only have electricity for an hour a day, you can't do that. So what's happening in Haiti now is that, for example, if you own a refrigerator, you've turned it into an icebox, if you can get ice.
That's what they
I'd
did
agree, they didn't
when I
have
was
24
there.
hours of electricity, but I would suspect they had 12, 14.
Well, in 1990 when I was there, it was only 1 or 2 hours a day.
Let's ask you to sort of walk us through these photos here a little further. Now,
Okay,
fine. Were these taken in your most recent trip, in the last few weeks?
They're a mixture of both of them. Most of these in this page were taken in the last 3 or 4 weeks.
Okay.
This right here is interesting. This is grain distribution into the city. The day before the new embargo, the 21st, a U.S. flagged ship docked with looks like rice, wheat, that sort of thing. It was unloaded the day after the embargo. You can see 5 vehicles right here loaded. Many more were heading north and south up to Gonaïves and south to the other areas. And during this day, I walked across the city. It took about 6 hours to walk across the city, and I watched this grain being distributed to almost every single person, I believe, in that city that wanted some. There was no formal system of distribution, but as I walked across the city, it was given to people. It was carried off on backs and carts and wheelbarrows, automobiles, whatever was running. And by the time I got across the city to the other side, which is in Port-au-Prince is probably 8 miles, 9 miles, something like that, those people 6 hours later were distributing this grain amongst themselves.
Were they being rationed, or could they get as much as they wanted?
No, as much as they wanted. The ironic thing was the next day it was being sold in the market.
That's what I was going to ask you next. How far was it to the marketplace?
So if you knew it was there and had a way to get to it, you could get what you wanted. This is downtown Port-au-Prince. A few pigs and animals live down there. The main point here, though, is that, again, without fuel, there's no way to pick up the garbage. The garbage collects all over the city. It flows into the streams and rivers, into the water supplies, into the ocean, and back onto the beaches. Now, this right here is the Port-au-Prince Cemetery. This used to be, as I understand it, talking with people, a nice old cemetery, several thousand of these above-ground crypts here. What's happened again, because the embargo limited limits replacement spare parts, fuel, that sort of thing, transportation. What's happened is almost every one of these graves, you can see in this picture every one, but almost every one in there is broken into within a day or two of the burial. The pieces of the casket are broken off, hinges, handles, that sort of thing, sold back to the undertakers for the next funeral, and the body stripped of the clothes and jewelry and left to rot in the sun. And that's certainly not the way it used to be, as I understand it. This is a good view of downtown Port-au-Prince. Again, open service and...
What is this? I'm sorry. This photograph.
I'm sorry.
Yep.
That is actually a person that I knew in Port-au-Prince. That's the house of an upper middle class person. Okay, this fellow here runs an auto body shop. His wife is an officer of the Bank of Paris, and he owns a small grain grinding mill in the countryside. The reason I included this was because this is exactly the kind of person that is right now today being targeted by the new Clinton policy, which is shut off their bank accounts, shut off their visas, et cetera, force these kinds of people to again, force the government to change. These people are apolitical, okay? There's no way that shutting off their bank accounts and their right to travel is going to make any difference in the government. This fellow is just like anybody here at this table. He makes a normal living. He has a normal job. He tries to live a normal existence, okay? What we did is we destroyed his lifestyle. That's
but
what we
that
did.
slide is the Port-au-Prince that image I have in my mind as a child.
This
That's
is
what
cared
I used
for.
to know.
This is cared for.
That's what
and
I
even though I have a nice picture here of his house, he has a nice house. Right next to his house, 2 feet away, is one of the largest slums in Port-au-Prince. Okay, I mean literally right on his doorstep. And the streets, you probably remember playing in the streets are gone. They long ago have washed into Harry Truman Boulevard.
And most of the businessmen and middle-class people that I meet and know there don't even talk about their business because they're afraid of what the military will do to them.
Yes, there's a large group of people like him. They call themselves apolitical.
Absolutely.
And they attempt to lead a normal existence. Okay. This is an interesting story here. You see no live cats in Haiti, at least no live cats in Port-au-Prince. This is a huge pile of skins here. Cats are killed, skinned, their meat is eaten, and the skins are tanned to make shoes for leather. This right here is a shot of the largest slum in Haiti. This was the area that was burned by the military about 3 months ago. A large number of people were killed, and I think 600 or 800 houses were destroyed. This right here is a collection of bodies along the highway outside of Port-au-Prince, heading north to St. Mark and Gonaive. It's certainly the country. I don't want to give the impression the country is awash in dead bodies. That's not the case. But this is the area that's referred to in the press as the killing fields of Haiti. This is where the bodies are dumped from Port-au-Prince, where people are taken out and shot. It's a very dry, desolate area along Highway 1 north of the city. But certainly there were bodies there. This is a shot from Gonaive. Gonaive was the city that actually, when the revolution to overthrow Jean-Claude in, I guess it was the late 80s, Papadoc in the late 80s, this is the city the revolution started in. This is also the city that is probably most supportive of Aristide these days. And this is a graffiti or sign painted on the front of the biggest church in town as you enter the city. It's also the city that just, I think it was in March, the military went in there and killed a number of people, mostly fishermen, and their bodies washed up on the shore for a good part of a week. This right here.
What does it say, Aristide?
That's Aristide or death. That certainly was a sentiment of those people. I talked to a lot of people in that city. I found one person that didn't support Aristide, and talked to dozens and dozens, and everyone else supported him vehemently. Although, as I said earlier, I didn't find a single person in all of Haiti that supported the current embargo. This is the returning U.S. Coast Guard cutter taking the refugees back into Port-au-Prince. When I was there, both trips, it came back every single day, loaded with people. The story at the time, the problem was that when Clinton announced his new policy of screening the refugees and letting them into the U.S., most people like myself here even misunderstood it. People in Haiti certainly misunderstood it. They literally sold everything that they owned to get on those boats to head out into the ocean, to be turned around, and they were back in Port-au-Prince 48 hours later, now with nothing in the hands of the military. Again, they misunderstood the policy. This is the another view of the docks in Port-au-Prince. These are the boats that are currently used for smuggling. You can see there 55-gallon fuel drums. These would contain gasoline from Dominican Republic, but also it gives you an idea of the size of the boats that are now being used by the refugees. It used to be very large boats were used. They're all gone. They're down to these small boats, maybe 15 to 24 feet, to make that, what's a 900-mile journey.
And yet, as we talk, it's announced today that they've just picked up over 6,000 this week,
Right.
hitting the boats again because of the policy in the United States and their 30% of people being allowed through.
And I finish here with just 3 pictures of children in Haiti, because that's probably the saddest story of all in Haiti is what this policy and embargo has done to these children. I was saying earlier that one of the main, I think the main driving force to the people to cause them to leave the country is their lack of hope. And I think that was universal in my discussions with people there, that not so much the repression, not so much the killings, not so much anything other than just complete lack of hope. You're talking about a country that has almost no trees left. The trees have been cut to make charcoal to cook meals, for example, because of lack of fuel. But they've had a problem with charcoal and erosion and trees, et cetera, for many, many years. But they've gotten to the point now there literally are no trees left, and the soil is washed into the ocean, is washing into the ocean. And places that before could farm, could sustain some sort of agriculture, can't do it anymore. So you've got people here with no jobs. They have no industries, no way to get a job, no money. They're fed by the government agencies free rice on a daily basis. That's what keeps them going. Although again, we cause most of this in the first place, but that's their life.
I guess I would like to say sort of separating the repression from the lack of hope, and I think that it makes sense also to really link the repression and the lack of hope, because I think the time of the elections of 1990 and the period of Aristide's presidency was a time of tremendous hope and popular organizing and church-based organizations and people really feeling and believing that social change could take place, and it's clear that Haiti is desperately in need of social change. And that the repression, I mean, the title of this film is Killing the Dream. The purpose of the repression has been to smother all of the kinds of social change, initiatives for social change, popular organizations, religious organizations, which have been trying to create hope by creating the conditions for social change.
Yeah, I was told that when I was there, that when Aristide was in office, there was a great movement to correct a lot of the cosmetic problems, for example. People felt that they needed to do something to support him. One of the things they could do, for example, was to clean up the garbage that had collected before that also. And that's a good example of that.
That was one of the first things I remember after the inauguration. Within a day or so of the inauguration, that was being done along Harry Truman Boulevard there, along the waterfront. That all of that garbage was starting to pick up, and I can remember when I first got there, it was all stacked up. But as you've heard me talk before, I think one of the elements that we talk about the United States not supporting Aristide's return, but talking about democracy, restoring democracy to Haiti. Aristide himself did campaign on a very anti-American platform during his election and during the campaign, and as a result, I think it just alienated a lot of Americans in the body politic, particularly. And then after he was elected, he started kind of, if you will, changing his tune to the party line so that he wouldn't lose the money from the goose that laid the golden egg. And I think that was part of it. And so there's, of course, as you know, 2 schools of thought on returning him or just returning to elections and another election, which I think he'd probably get reelected anyway. But we have to support democracy in Haiti. That he was, no matter whether we agree with what he did or hasn't done, he was democratically elected.
I think we should talk about that a little bit, because one of the reasons I get back to why are we interested in this here. I mean, we're interested in it from sort of the humanitarian point of view. I mean, it's a tragedy, and it's a tragedy that literally is washing up on our shores. In forms of boat people or corpses. I mean, it's this terrible human tragedy that we're experiencing. And the point Avi made at the outset was that this is not something we are idle bystanders to, but perhaps the product of a long U.S. policy towards Latin America, perhaps in general, but Haiti in particular. And I think that, from at least my own point of view, and I think I expressed the view of a lot of people in the National Labor Committee for Democracy in Central America. I mean, there's a large organization of of unions who are concerned about democracy in Central America, not only from a humanitarian perspective, but also from the point of view that says, you know, if without the rise of democracy in countries like Haiti, then all of our freedoms, all of our ability to have a decent standard of living for ourselves and our families going forward is threatened and jeopardized. And I think that's what we're concerned with here is seeing what's happened in Haiti since the election, the first time in however long that Haiti elected in its entire history, elected its own ruler who set about making some rather startling changes, or at least began down that path. And it's the overthrow of that democratically elected government and what that portends for the people of Haiti and for all of us, I think, that has us most concerned.
And also, I think the fact that Haiti, most people are not aware of it, but Haiti is, next to the United States, the oldest independent country in the hemisphere. Only a few years after we gained our independence, Haiti did, with the rebellion in Cape Haitian by some of the slaves against their masters.
Should also mention that the U.S. refused to recognize Haitian
Absolutely,
independence
exactly.
because
That is right.
the U.S. was trying to enforce the slave system and
Yes,
did not want to recognize the
That's a good point, Avi. Excellent. Yeah.
So U.S. involvement in
it goes all the way back.
opposing Haitian independence was around for a long time.
Right.
Yes.
So the United States talked a lot about the importance of democracy in Haiti, and when Aristide was elected, over some would say there were some efforts that's been suggested that the United States government may have tried to prevent Aristide from being elected in the first place. But once he was elected by an overwhelming majority of the population, talk to us a little bit about what are some of the changes that he tried to, beyond the cosmetic sort of things that we talked about, what are some of the structural changes that he tried to introduce into the country in his short tenure?
Well, he doubled the wage overnight.
Doubled the wage overnight.
Or he tried, yes.
Double the wage overnight. Sound familiar, folks?
To go back to answer that, I'd sort of like to go back to what you said, that he campaigned on an anti-American platform, because I think that's true to a certain extent, and I think there's a good reason for it, which is the kind of economic and social policies that the U.S. was promoting in Haiti from the time of its occupation in 15 to 34. A kind of economic development model that's really similar to what it's promoted everywhere in Latin America, and the U.S. vision of Latin America as an economic partner, as they call it, is as a supplier of cheap raw materials and cheap labor to U.S. industry. And that's a kind of economic policy that doesn't work well with democracy, because it's not in the best interests of most of the people of Haiti to be maintained as a low-wage manufacturing place for U.S. industries. It's also a kind of economic policy that's not in the best interest of most people in the U.S., because most people in the U.S. don't benefit from U.S. industries going to other lower-wage countries. And it's a kind of policy that doesn't work very well with democracy, because democracy means freedom, human rights, freedom of expression, right to form organizations, freedom from military terror. And in order to maintain the social and economic policies, which the U.S. supports not only in Haiti but throughout Latin America, military terror has historically been a large part of that. That is, how do you prevent workers from organizing labor unions and asking for higher wages?
Well, the United States' approach is a very ethnocentric approach to democracy, as I see it. Democracy's got to be as we do it only, though.
Well, but they don't want Latin America to really do it the way we do it either. I mean, and if you look at every case of U.S. intervention in Latin America, they've intervened against democracies, as in Chile in 1973, Guatemala in 54, Nicaragua throughout the 1980s.
Well, it goes back to the 1800s in Nicaragua also.
They've also intervened against brutal military dictators on occasion when they become inconvenient, and I think that's what's happening with the military dictatorship in Haiti right now. It's becoming inconvenient. But the reason for intervention is the same in both cases. It's not for democracy. It's for a particular kind of social and economic development in Latin America. And if you look at the kinds of programs they've put in place after the invasion of Grenada, after the invasion of Panama, in Haiti prior to Aristide's election, they are basically low-wage policies and the kinds of political and military actions that are needed to maintain Haiti as a poor country, because the interests of the U.S. government and the U.S. business community are to maintain Haiti as a poor country, and that's not
But
in
what
the
about
interest
the
of
element
most
of the
Haitians.
gross national product of Haiti is infinitesimal to, you know, it's smaller than many of our companies, corporate structures right here, a single corporate structure in the United States.
Well,
How do you reconcile that?
the United States does not want fundamental social and economic change anywhere in Latin America. If people can do it in Haiti, people will try to do it somewhere else. And that's, I mean, the reason they've been so opposed to Cuba all along. They came straight out and said that in the case of Nicaragua. They didn't have very much actual investment in Nicaragua, but they didn't want Nicaragua to have a successful revolution because that would have inspired other countries which were economically more important to the United States to try to struggle for social
Which was under a
change.
different administration. Why do you think this current administration hasn't switched that?
I don't think there's any difference in terms of policy towards Latin America. You don't see any difference between Democrats and Republicans. And in fact, you saw Clinton, when he was campaigning, saying that he was going to change policy towards Haiti.
That's true.
One of the things that the Bush administration did, and this shows the ties with the business community, in putting forth this embargo after the coup, was to exempt U.S. industries in Haiti from the embargo. Clinton campaigned saying that he was going to have a real embargo. Well, it took him a couple of years to get there. Maybe now he's actually trying to do that. He campaigned that he was going to reverse Bush's policy on refugees, and he did exactly the opposite of that. He continued the policy on refugees. The changes which have taken place now, there have been some changes, but still the fact is that the majority of Haitians trying to escape are still sent back by the U.S., and many of them are sent back to
70%.
immediately be arrested, tortured, disappeared. There's one example that I put up there. You probably don't want to look at the mangled face in the photograph, but it's an actual photograph of somebody who tried to come to the United States and was sent back, fingerprinted, identified, and later kidnapped, disappeared, and found by his family. Days later, tortured and killed. And this is not the only case. The human rights organizations have documented repeated instances of this, refugees who were sent back by the U.S., who were immediately or soon after picked up by the military.
Charles made the point in looking at these slides and looking at the kinds of vessels that people are now escaping on that, you know, there's this, you know, human wave of people who are leaving and taking essentially, they're selling off, I think as you put it, they're selling anything they have to raise the money to take for the passage, and within 24, 48 hours they are then, you know, repatriated back with now nothing and turned into the hands of the military. And I wonder, Magda, whether this is something you've had any communication with your family about. What are you hearing from family and friends in Haiti about their perspective on this right now? Is it as hopeless as has been portrayed?
Well, my family, we tend to pretty much do what the slide you showed us of. I guess we're fortunate. We're middle-class people in Haiti. We tend to kind of, we try to send money when we can, but even in sending money to family, they don't get it. If a family member is going to Haiti physically, then we give them money to give to other family members, so that helps out their livelihood. But in speaking to them, they tend to basically just stay apolitical, not get involved. They're really, there's nothing they can do. So unfortunately, none of my family members have tried to cross over through the boats, or I guess they're fortunate where they do make some type of living, and we as a family, we send money to them and to help support their livelihood.
But there is this like exponential growth, though, in the number of people who are now, you know, attempting to make the trip. And I guess there's a question as to what's the reason, and maybe they're connected, but is it the embargo? Is it the current policy of trying to embargo and force from government the
reason?
Yeah, what's the reason?
I think the reason is the hopelessness. Everybody that I talked to, I think everybody without exception, really said that the reason they wanted to leave was because it was hopeless.
Okay, but
like
why?
Over and over again, Haiti is hopeless. They feel it's hopeless because it's an ecological disaster. We haven't talked much about that, but the forests have been destroyed. The ground, the soil has been washed away. The country is literally full of garbage, and there's no obvious way to turn around the ecology of the country, just to start with. Jobs, we talked a little bit about the assembly industry. That was 100,000 jobs in Port-au-Prince. They were the only jobs in Port-au-Prince. If you didn't work there, you either had maybe a handful of jobs in foreign banks and that sort of thing, or you pulled a cart around all day with moving goods around the city. I mean, those were the jobs in Port-au-Prince. You get outside of Port-au-Prince to Gonaïves, to St. Marc, to Corridon, to Anse Rouge, and those places, and there is no such thing as an occupation or a job.
But I think it's more than that. I think it's also just, I think it is also the terror, knowing that you can, people, the boat people, it's not just about economics, it's also about being terrorized and fear and the political, how it's escalated.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you, Mike. Do you
home,
think your parents, or like your dad, they stay political, but do you think, for example, in correspondence with you and even phones, if you can't get through, that that they're afraid that maybe one of those letters might get intercepted?
Absolutely.
And
you can't say too much.
You can't say much,
Say things in between the lines. We try to correspond by saying tapes. Like some of my uncles will say a tape and send it with somebody who's coming over, or pay someone to carry on their person. You can't really do things through the mail because the mail is read, money's taken, so it's not really safe. But I think it's more than just financial. I know it's also the fear in people that somebody can come into your home and terrorize, brutalize, and kill and massacre your family or extended families. That's why people are looking to leave, not because they just can't find a job.
There's certainly some truth to that. I agree. But also in Haiti, I found outside of Port-au-Prince, maybe within to some extent, but certainly outside Port-au-Prince, the people were very comfortable with the environment. And it's contrary to what you hear, it's contrary to what we're saying here, but in cities like St. Marc, in cities like Gonaïves, etc., these people would go out and they would wander around all night long, okay? They would do whatever they want, and they were absolutely unafraid of the kind of things we would be afraid of here in the United States, wandering around Portland, much less Boston, New York, Chicago, Detroit, or any other major city in the United States, okay? These are cities of up to 500,000 people in the countryside.
I found this to be true in Okai in the south, too.
Exactly.
But within the Port-au-Prince itself,
but within Port-au-Prince, a little different. Although my host, who certainly lives as your family would, I suspect they do anyways, he would tell me, "Oh man, can't go down to the city after dark because you'll be picked up and killed, whatever." So one night I just wandered down to the city and it was full of people. Okay, people were coming and going. It looked like daytime. The taps are running. There were literally tens of thousands of people on the street. So.
But I think there's a difference between street crime and political
right, and that was my
repression.
point, is many people in Haiti, as your family has, and the people I know have learned how to live sort of an apolitical existence. And they are fairly safe if they live an apolitical existence. They don't have street crime, they don't have burglaries, okay, they don't have those sorts of American kinds of violence, all right? And if they're apolitical, they almost never run afoul of the military.
Unless they're poor and live in the wrong neighborhood.
If they're poor, yeah, if they live in the slums, they're controlled by the current Tonton Macoux, which is a frap, okay? And they act and look and are every bit like the old Tonton Macoux, and they control these people the same way.
So the most dangerous thing, at least what I hear you saying, the most dangerous thing is to express any sort of political opinion whatsoever, to exercise in any way what we would call democracy, which is allegedly what the United States is promoting. That's right. The worst thing you can possibly do is in any way express any sentiment, pro-democracy sentiment.
But I'll have to tell you the story that there were a few people I talked to that did tell me during Aristide's time, okay, that they had to be very careful of what they said, okay, because if they were too politically vocal against him, okay, they stood the chance of being necklaced or killed. Okay, now I don't know if that's true, but they firmly believed that was the case.
You might explain what necklacing is. That's a very important thing, because a lot of that goes on in Haiti. Just very briefly.
Put a tire around somebody's neck, fill it with fuel, and light it on fire. It's used all over the world, not just Haiti. It's an African tradition as well.
If you look at human rights conditions and human rights violations, any of the longer term looks at it from U.S.-based human rights organizations, UN human rights organizations, it's very clear that although there were human rights violations during Aristide's period, they didn't absolutely disappear. They went way, way down, and it was just a really dramatic change in terms of freedom of expression.
I wouldn't argue that. I would say that's because most of the people supported him. But you still had the same rules. You still had to be somewhat apolitical. You had to be careful.
Or for him.
Or for him, right. It's just there were less people that were not for him.
Yeah, a long culture of having no democracy and no ability to express oneself seems to me fairly reasonable to think that will take some long period of time.
I think that's one of the key things with Haiti is they don't understand that. They don't understand how to exist within democracy.
Well, and
See,
a
I don't
democracy
think
without
that's the
Latin
case at
America.
all. I don't think that's
Absolutely.
the case at
I
all.
agree.
I think it's the United States that doesn't know how to allow democracy in Latin America, because the Haitians showed very well that they do know how to have a democracy and live in a democracy with Aristide. It was the U.S. and the military, which was trained by the U.S. and supported by the U.S.
Not really.
I don't agree.
that,
We had a democracy in Haiti for what, 9 months?
Yeah.
Was that the length of time?
If you-
A 9-month democracy?
And, well, if you want to call it democracy,
Well,
a
we
bit of
had
a precarious democracy.
an elected, a democratically elected president
Fair statement.
for 9
Didn't give a
months.
man much chance to do much.
I would say. This may be an appropriate time. Would that be correct to look at the little video clip we have of
Sure.
sort of after the coup? We're trying our best to sort of patch in slides and video and so on, and we hope this works. But as I recall, this piece of the videotape picks up after the coup. And do you want to set the stage for this a little bit, Avi, so that when we go to it?
Well, it's a discussion actually of some of the issues that we've been discussing here in terms of what do the poor people in Haiti want, what is Aristide trying to do, and why does the military and the U.S. oppose what Aristide is trying to do.
Okay, let's see if we can take a look at that and catch this on the camera.
It starts out by talking about the embargo.
The international community condemned the military coup, and the OAS isolated the new regime with an embargo.
The United States joined and supported the OAS mission to Haiti that tried to find a diplomatic solution. When that did not succeed, the United States supported the trade embargo that was enacted 8 days following the coup, and we have put that embargo into effect.
The embargo has paralyzed Haiti's already atrophied economy, but it has failed to dislodge the coup leaders from power. The Bush administration, claiming concern for Haitian jobs, lifted the embargo on American assembly plants.
The U.S. formally opposed the coup. My assumption is that it is waiting for an appropriate moment to find a way to restore to dominance in the society the wealthy business classes and the military, who are the natural U.S. allies, because they will ensure stability. They'll help Haiti become part of the Caribbean system that the U.S. is trying to create, a system which provides super cheap labor, which will be our East Asia, basically.
Aristide's proposal to raise the minimum wage from $3 to $5 a day antagonized both American and Haitian business leaders, such as the reputed mastermind of the coup, Jean-Claude Roy.
If you speak only on the economical level, Aristide never brought the climate that would be advantageous for investment or for business expansion. All to the contrary, there was continuous threats on what he called the bourgeois patriote and the bourgeois patrie poche. And there were definitely a lot of threats against me. My view on that is that Aristide should perhaps return, but he should return to be judged. He should return to be tried.
With the economy in shambles, most Haitians still believe their hopes for democracy and a better life are linked to Aristide's return.
The thing is, we voted only for one president. We are waiting for him. He must return.
Why wouldn't we want him to return? We were secure then. Do you understand? We had great hope. We had great hope. But right now, what hope? Right now, it's as if they've already dug our graves.
Either Aristide returns or he doesn't. Understand? It's him we are waiting for. I know I have suffered a lot for him. I'm not there for the money. I have a trade. I have a right to live in my country. It is he who showed me the vote. Now it's dog eat dog. I would prefer killing myself if he were not to return. I'm very happy there is no gas.
Despite the embargo, oil tankers continue to arrive in Port-au-Prince, and the wealthy get what they need from across the Dominican border. But the poor, who many suggest are suffering the most from the embargo, are still its most ardent supporters.
We are suffering, it's true, but it's the big shots who are suffering also. I believe they will start suffering before me because we are used to touch light and everything else. We are resigned to take it, but it's Aristide who must return here.
We will use pine wood. We will use touchlight. We are used to eating leaves. We will eat leaves. We'll eat leaves. We have sweet potato buds. We know how to use the land. We'll find sweet potato buds.
Don't you see how much weight I've lost? Since Aristide left, I've lost a lot of weight.
Look, every day I hear the clock strike bang at 12. I think Aristide's return. I'm so happy.
Progressive Catholic parishes remain rallying points for Aristide supporters.
Oh Lord, you gave him to us. You chose him. You gave him to us because you saw that we deserve him. And now a group of villains are putting him through the same thing they put Jesus through. And now, Jesus, you will send him back to us. We are dying. We cannot talk. Our mouths have been sealed. Our feet are tied. Our children cannot go into the street. We cannot do anything.
Oh Lord, look at what misery we're in. Liberate us, because we have never forgotten your laws. Those who have betrayed the country are disgusting to us.
Bishop Romulus of Jérémie has long been a courageous moral voice in Haiti.
The Haitian army is the only master on this land. It does what it wants. It arrests people anytime it wants. It beats anyone it wants. It puts people in prison anytime it wants. This is the situation where people are cornered.
More violence every night, because every day we find something new, and I don't like it anyway.
And so we've looked at a little bit of what's gone on in Haiti in the days after the coup. That's some year ago that film was taken. I wonder if we might, in the last remaining moments we have, talk a little bit about what are some of the things that might be done to support the return of democracy in Haiti.
I've put this list up here, and I think looking at the list also shows really clearly what the U.S. has not been doing, and shows that it has not been supporting the return of democracy to Haiti. This is a list that was put together by a group of human rights and peace organizations in the United States with the support of the Haitian Popular Movement and the peasant movement in Haiti, asking for a change in U.S. policy. No more negotiations with coup leaders. The U.S. has been legitimizing the coup leaders, calling for amnesty for the coup leaders, asking Aristide, pressuring Aristide very hard to expand his government, to incorporate the military and the coup that is opposing democracy. He was democratically elected. The coup overthrew him. To ask him to now accept the coup as a fact and cooperate with it is not supporting democracy in Haiti. Zealous enforcement of sanctions, well, we've been talking about the leakiness of the embargo. No military intervention, and this is a very important one because the U.S. has been talking about military intervention. I think it's clear to peace and human rights groups in the U.S. as well as to the poor in Haiti and the Haitian Popular Movement that a U.S. military intervention will not bring democracy to Haiti, that a U.S. military intervention will bring the kind of government that the U.S. has been supporting in Haiti for the last 100 years, the kinds of governments that it has supported in other countries like Grenada, Nicaragua, Chile, after their military interventions or support of military coups in those countries. Safe haven for refugees, this is another really crucial one. The United States claims to be supporting democracy and opposing the coup, and yet it's sending refugees back to whatever the military leaders want to do with them, and that is an absolute contravention to international law as well as to any support for human rights or democracy in Haiti.
Do you feel as part of what we should do is to open our doors, period, and let anybody, any of the Haitians that want to come?
Yes, and I think that Clinton's formulation of that in very racist terms and his reiteration that our main policy goal is to stop the refugees is not a way of supporting democracy at all.
On the
but
basis
I
that
also
this is a disaster essentially the United States has created and should take the consequences and be responsible. Is that?
But there's also many historical cases of much smaller and poorer countries in the United States accepting much larger numbers of refugees in situations of war and terror.
What can we do right here in Maine, Avi, to really get involved and do something about it?
I'll tell you, let me just say one other thing on this list. Investigate an NCIA, USAID, and National Endowment for Democracy misdoings in Haiti. There's a lot that our government does that Clinton doesn't get up and announce. It occasionally makes it into the papers, like this article in the New York Times. CIA formed Haitian unit later tied to narcotics trade. The headline doesn't say that it also included many of the coup leaders. They were actually people who were recruited by the CIA and in the pay of the CIA all along. Clinton doesn't announce this when he gets on TV, but it is known and documented. What can we do? The first thing is educate yourself about the U.S. and Haiti. What has U.S. policy in Haiti been? And there's a couple of resources. This book was just published by Common Courage Press here in Maine, Paul Farmer, The Uses of Haiti, which gives a very excellent background to U.S. policy in Haiti. And it was published in May of '94, and it covers up to the end of April '94, so it really tells you.
Where can they get that?
Common Courage Press, you can order it from your bookstore. Paul Farmer, The Uses of Haiti. You can also call us at this phone number down here, 786-6462.
We'll have it in Portland, too, with our store for you.
Okay. The NACLA Report on the Americas, there's lots of resources that are out that talk about what's going on in Haiti and where you can find out some of this information.
I would also just mention the National Labor Committee for the coalition of 18 unions that has been focusing on democracy and human rights in Central America and Latin America. This is the report recently done by the National Labor Committee, which operates out of our union's headquarters in New York City, on Haiti after the coup, and any information labor-related can be gotten right here through our union office in Biddeford. So. And in the last 30 seconds, we need to...
well, tell people to contact us to change U.S. policy in Haiti, support the rights of refugees, support the popular movement for democracy. There is a Haiti Solidarity Committee here in Maine. We're going to be sponsoring a week of events the week of July 10th. And we hope people will get involved. Contact us.
Okay. Well, thank you. And I'm sorry that in the very waning seconds of this, I have to very quickly, without opportunity for comment, wrap up the show by thanking my guests, Magda Adrien from Haiti, Avi Chomsky from Bates College, Charles Carpenter, from Scarborough, the photographer, and Lou Bergeron from the Center for Intercultural Education in Portland. Thank you all for spending an hour.
Thank you for having us.
Appreciate it, and encourage our viewers for more information about Haiti and the developing situation there. Please feel free to contact us here at Cavanaugh's Corner. We will be happy to provide more opportunities for discussion about this issue as it unfolds. So, thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
And I mean, you speculated as to why. I mean, what was their interest in organizing, in business interest, organizing to oppose Aristide?
Maybe I could give a quick nutshell, which is that when Aristide was elected, the Reagan-Bush policy of free trade development through and development only through free trade and through business activity was in full swing. When Aristide was elected, he announced that he wanted to raise the minimum wage in Haiti. He said he wanted to raise the minimum wage from 22 cents an hour to 35 cents an hour. Now, this would have made the Haitian minimum wage still the second lowest in the hemisphere after the Dominican Republic. This was too much for USAID. And they, in response to the very first democratically elected president in Haiti's history, said, well, we need to teach the Haitians how to conduct democracy, and we'll set up this democracy promotion program. And what they did essentially was to give this $23 million to a business elite to oppose Aristide's minimum wage. This became an absolute furor in the country. The business elite had a lot of money to play with to increase opposition, and they said the minimum wage would ruin the country and so forth. Virtually on the day that the minimum wage was to go into effect, Aristide was thrown from power. The coup occurred.